Thank you. Thanks very much for that. I must say that sounded suspiciously like a eulogy, especially in these kind of somber surroundings. I was sitting there and thinking, did I somehow walk into my own funeral by mistake? But I'm really delighted to be here, and this is an incredibly high-powered audience, and down to the 3 fifth graders right here, and so welcome to all of you. I think it really is important that we have this audience. I thank the Blank Foundation for bringing us here, because the reality is that if there is going to be an effort to address issues like genocide or issues like humanitarian needs in Africa, it's not going to emerge, as one might expect, from Washington, but rather from real America. And when I was saying that, I noticed some of you looking sort of surprised. Leadership from Washington? Where would you get that idea? But the reality is, in fact, that's right. That, for example, on the issue of genocide, which is obviously near and dear to my heart. Whether it was in 1915 Armenians being slaughtered when Woodrow Wilson, for all of his idealism, looking the other way, or FDR during the Holocaust, refusing pleas to at least try to bomb the rail lines to Auschwitz, or the Clinton administration refusing to even use the word genocide during Rwanda for fear that then they might have to actually do something. There is a pretty consistent and bipartisan record, unfortunately, in refusing to take the lead. And to the extent that there has been effort to address these issues, it's come from grassroots, from the grassroots. There was actually some reason to think that with this administration, when Darfur began, that it might have been different. President Bush, shortly after he took office, was reading a report about how President Clinton had not done anything about Rwanda. And he famously scrawled in the margin of that, "Not on my watch." And for those of you who know those green Save Darfur armbands, I mean, that is the origin of that. And so you do get the sense that President Bush at some intellectual level really did aspire to do better than the Clinton administration, for example, had done. And I think that in general, presidents and administrations go into office thinking that they are going to really make a difference on humanitarian causes, and then invariably they don't make headway unless there is a constituency out there pushing them for it. And that's your job. That's our job. Our elected leaders aspire in their hearts to do better, and they don't or they can't unless that leadership comes from the ground up. I'd like to cover a few of the issues, and I think maybe the most effective way of addressing them is to raise the objections that I think people sometimes articulate, but at least often feel about why we should be concerned with humanitarian concerns in Africa or with genocide in Darfur. And so let me try to raise some of those concerns that I think people feel, and give you what I think is the response that at least works for me. And a starting point is simply the question of why Africa? There are so many needs, including in this country. Shouldn't we address our own needs before we go gallivanting around the globe and address other people's? And I have a contest every year where I take a student with me to Africa. And the first year I did that, I took a young woman from Mississippi who had grown up in poverty, and she very much felt that way. She was very skeptical of this whole notion of, why was jumping up and down about Africa. And then we got to one of the issues we were addressing was maternal health, maternal mortality. And we were in a little clinic in southeastern Cameroon talking to the doctor about maternal mortality, and we knew intellectually that 500,000 women a year die in childbirth or pregnancy in the developing world. And then, as we were talking to the doctor, it turned out that there was a woman in the next room she was from a village. She had 3 kids already, her 4th pregnancy. When she went into labor, labor was obstructed. She had a blocked cervix, and the midwife, after 2 days, had sat on her stomach. The uterus had ruptured. Somebody in the village had taken her to the hospital on a motorcycle, and then the doctor had asked for $100 to remove the fetus, and the family didn't have $100. And there was such contempt as well from the medical staff for this woman because A, she was female, and B, she was poor, and C, she was rural, she was a villager, that even when we provided the $100, and when we gave blood, because the doctor said, well, anyway, she would need a blood transfusion if we were to operate, when we gave blood for that, then even so, he just went out the back way and went home, and we watched her die. And so this young woman I take in from Mississippi, she had remembered going without health insurance when she was growing up and the frustration of that. But she said, at least I could go to the emergency ward and people weren't dying right in the hospital because nobody would look at them. And it really is different. This year, I took the Win-A-Trip winner to the place that is the site of the most lethal war since World War II. Anybody know what country that is? Congo, yeah. The Congo, it gets very little coverage, which probably is an indictment of what those of us in the news media do, but it's the most lethal conflict since World War II. Maybe roughly 5 million people have died there since 1998, and it obviously doesn't get coverage. And so we went to eastern Congo, which is still in huge turmoil. And at one point, we were in a camp for internally displaced people, and we asked about rape victims. And so one of the camp people introduced a woman who had been raped by the militias, which is a tool there, as in much of the world. It's become a weapon of war. And so we were interviewing her under one tree, and we wanted to give her some privacy. We didn't want anybody else clustering around. We noticed that there was a group of women who were sort of forming, too close, maybe a dozen feet away. And so we tried to shoo them away a little bit. And they explained, we've all been raped. We want to tell our story too. And that it was so painful to see a situation like that where you have these people lining up to tell their stories. We met a woman called Cecily who she'd had 3 kids. 2 years ago, in a bout of unrest, the 2 elder children had starved to death. The youngest one was still nursing at the breast, and so was able to get enough milk, and so Cecily was able to keep the baby alive. Then 2 months before we had arrived, her husband had been out trying to farm their plot, and one of these militias had gone out and killed him. After that, Cecily couldn't go out because of the risk into the fields to till their land or to harvest the crops, and nobody else in the village dared to either. And so her baby, the youngest child, was starving to death. It's an exceptionally painful way to die, and a slow-motion way to die. And, so there certainly are problems here in this country. We need to address those issues of poverty, but there really is a difference between the humanitarian needs abroad in a place like eastern Congo and those here, and we can do both at the same time. Now, I think another objection that people often have is that there's a sense, and again, this is one I think people feel more often than they articulate, but a sense that, look, it's too bad about Africa, but frankly, Africa's always a mess. It always has been. What's the point of trying to, bail these people out? They'll just be at war again. It's hopeless. And my answer to that is very much shaped by having lived in Asia for much of my career. I lived in China for 7 years, and you look back at China, and for much of modern history, that's exactly what people said about China, that it was hopeless. And in fact, China in 1950 had a lower per capita income than it had had at the end of the Sung dynasty in 1290. And these days, it's common to say that, well, China is booming because of its culture. Well, all those centuries when China was going downhill, everybody was writing it off, and they were saying, oh, it's because of its culture. And Bangladesh as well. Henry Kissinger famously referred to Bangladesh as a basket case. And in fact, if I can almost measure the moment when Bangladesh hit its low, because that's the moment that I chose to write an article saying that basically Bangladesh is more or less hopeless. And just at that moment, it picked up and improved. And in fact, I think Africa has already turned the corner. If you look at Africa's growth rates, this year it's going to grow at about 6%, which is more than double the economic growth rate of the U.S. You get some countries that have really been booming, and there are a lot of other needs in other places. But as governance improves, you do get a sense that Africa really does have a future and can follow Bangladesh and other countries. I think there's another related issue, and that is that it may be that we in the news media harp too much on the failures, that what we tend to do is cover the famines and not the places that are succeeding. And it may be that disproportion. There's a debate in journalism about this question. I mean, if part of it is that we tend to cover the planes that crash, not the planes that take off, and we do the same for countries. We cover countries that crash, not the countries that take off. But it may be that this emphasis on doom and gloom does paint a picture that is not only unrepresentative of the mosaic as a whole, but perhaps is also not always helpful to the larger continent. I also think that to the extent that Africa does face some real problems, we have to acknowledge that we are part of those problems, and climate change is the biggest example. That climate change is a huge challenge for Africa in the coming decades, and part of that is that if you have certain fragility in countries already, then if the rainfall doesn't come, in Atlanta, there are coping mechanisms. If rain doesn't come in Burundi, then people die. And Africa is not producing any carbon emissions to speak of. Their rainfalls are affected because of our carbon emissions. And it's obviously very difficult to gauge, and there's a lot of uncertainty. But it may well be that our carbon emissions are vastly dwarfing the assistance that we have provided.